Hello everybody, this is Alex Torres. Now, I want to have a little discussion of what happened on the events of May 25th, 2020 in Minneapolis. Obviously, I'm talking about the George Floyd incident. Now, these two bananas that you see, they represent the trachea, which is a pathway, an airway for your brain and your lungs to get oxygen. Now, it is known in self-defense that with 5 pounds of pressure per inch, you could already start to block airway, and you could start to feel the effects within around a minute, 30 seconds to 2 minutes. The lack of oxygen, a person is disoriented and may even start to hallucinate and lose consciousness. Now, this is about 10 pounds of pressure. See how I ripped? Here's with another 10, which is 20. Now, and I haven't even let it go. Now let's look at the effects. See how it squashed? It opened up. Now Mr. Floyd had about 160, 170 pounds of body mass on top of his neck. Obviously, all the power, all the weight was focused on the knee. A knee which is solid, it's bone. With this added weight on, the effects of his airway being crushed would have been devastating. Now, Mr. Floyd was on the floor for about 8 minutes, 46 seconds. This was, which was on road pitch, tart. Because of the sun, the road, it get up to 140 degrees Fahrenheit of heat. Now, Mr. Floyd was claustrophobic, so even before having his neck crushed or pressured, he already had the effects of heat taking away oxygen from his body. Now, if you don't mind, from this position, which was the last position Mr. Floyd has consciousness, I have here in my hands the police report. Now, it states, May 25th, 2020, someone called 911 and reported that a man brought merchandise from Cup Foods at 3759 Chicago Avenue in Minneapolis, Hennepin County, Minnesota, with a counterfeit $20 bill. At 8:08 p.m., Minneapolis Police Department officers Thomas Lane and J.A. Kung arrived with their body-worn cameras, BWCs, activated and running. The officers learned from store personnel that the man who passed the counterfeit $20 was parked in a car around the corner from the store on 38th Street. BWC video obtained by the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension shows that the officers approached the car, Lane on the driver's side and Kung on the passenger side. 3 people were in the car. George Floyd was in the driver's seat. A known adult male was in the passenger seat, and a known adult female was sitting in the back seat. As Officer Lane began speaking with Mr. Floyd, he pulled his gun out and pointed it at Mr. Floyd's open window and directed Mr. Floyd to show his hands. When Mr. Floyd put his hands in the steering wheel, Lane put his gun back in the holster. While Officer Kung was speaking with the front seat passenger, Officer Lane ordered Mr. Floyd out of the car, put his hands on Mr. Floyd, and pulled him out of the car. Officer Lane handcuffed Mr. Floyd. Mr. Floyd actively resisted being handcuffed. Once handcuffed, Mr. Floyd became compliant and walked with Officer Lane to the sidewalk and sat on the ground at Officer Lane's direction. In a conversation that lasted just under 2 minutes, Officer Lane asked Mr. Floyd for his name and identification. Officer Lane asked Mr. Lloyd if he was on anything, and explained that he was arresting Mr. Lloyd for passing counterfeit currency. Officers Kung and Lane stood Mr. Floyd up and attempted to walk Mr. Floyd to the squad car. At 8:14 p.m., Mr. Floyd stiffened up. He got tense, fell to the ground, and told the officers he was claustrophobic. MPD officers Derek Chauvin, the defendant, and Toa when arrived in a separate squad car, I guess as backup. The officers made several attempts to get Mr. Floyd in the back seat of the squad 320 from the driver's side. Mr. Floyd did not voluntarily get in the car and struggled with the officers by intentionally falling down, saying he was not going to the car, and refused to stand still. Mr. Floyd is over 6 feet tall and weighs more than 200 pounds. While standing outside the car, Mr. Floyd began saying and repeating that he could not breathe. The defendant went to the passenger side and tried to get Mr. Floyd into the car from that side, and Lane and Kung assisted. The defendant pulled Mr. Floyd out of the passenger side of the squad car at 8:19 p.m. and Mr. Floyd went to the ground face down and still handcuffed. Kung held Mr. Floyd back and Lane held his legs. The defendant placed his knee in the area of Mr. Floyd's head and neck. Mr. Floyd said, "I can't breathe," multiple times. "I can't breathe." And repeatedly said, "Mama," and "please" were words that he shot out. "Mama, please." As well, a defendant and the other officers stayed in their position. The officer said, "You're talking fine," to Mr. Floyd, and he continued to move back and forth. Lane asked, "Should we roll him on his side?" The defendant said, "No. Staying put where we got him." Officer Lane said, "I'm worried about excited delirium or whatever." The defendant said, "That's why we have him on his stomach." None of the officers moved from their positions. The BWC video shows Mr. Floyd continued to move and breathe. At 8:24 p.m., Mr. Floyd stopped moving. He stopped moving. At 8:25, the video appears to show Mr. Floyd ceasing to breathe or to speak. Lane said, "Want to roll him on his side?" Kung checked Mr. Floyd's right wrist and pulse and said, "I can't find one." None of the officers moved from their position. At 8:27 p.m., the defendant removed his knee from Mr. Floyd's neck. An ambulance and emergency medical personnel arrived. The officers placed Mr. Floyd on the gurney. The ambulance left the scene. Mr. Floyd was pronounced dead at Hennepin County Medical Center. The Hennepin County Medical Examiner conducted Mr. Floyd's autopsy May 26, 2020. The full report of the ME is pending, but the ME has made the county preliminary findings. The autopsy revealed no physical findings that supported diagnosis of traumatic asphyxia or strangulation. Mr. Floyd had underlying health problems, including coronary artery disease, hypertensive heart disease. The combined effect of Mr. Floyd's being restrained by the police, his underlying health conditions, and any potential intoxicants in his system likely contributed to his death. The defendant had his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds in total. 2 minutes, 53 seconds of this after Mr. Floyd was non-responsive. Police are trained that this type of restraint, a subject is prone position, is inherently dangerous. The defendant is in custody. This is where the report ends. It's noted that the defendant, Eric Michael Chauvin, was charged 3rd degree, perpetrating eminently dangerous act and evincing depraved mind. Charge 2, manslaughter second degree, culpable negligence, creating unreasonable risk. Now, I read to you the report. Everybody has their own opinion.